Welcome to The Currency of Grief, the podcast where we confront two of society's most taboo topics, death and money. My name is Justin Weidenfeld, and I'm here to serve as your grief financial officer, guiding you through the complex and emotional journey of what happens when money and mortality collide. Whether you're navigating the aftermath of losing a loved one, looking for practical advice on handling pre- and post-death planning, or simply just wanting to start those hard conversations about legacy while you still can, this space is for you. Together, we'll hear real-life stories from real-life people who have navigated the intersection of grief and money and come out the other side. Our guests will share their stories, practical insights, valuable advice, and moments of clarity so that none of you have to navigate this alone. I'm grateful you've decided to join us on this journey. Now let's dive in. So without further ado, let's dive in.
Well, first, I just wanted to say thank you for having me back, first of all. And second of all, what do you mean people don't want to just talk about estate law and financial stuff for hours and hours of their life? That's not what regular people want to talk about.
I mean, I feel like at least, I would love to talk about it for hours. But
Right.
yeah, no, I feel like especially it's summer, it's August 6th, we're recording this. People want to play pickleball, probably go to the golf course. And if they are maybe hitting the driving range, listening to a podcast, maybe they have an hour of this in their ears and
Sure.
maybe something more motivational or music or something more fun.
No, I get it. We're both blasted parties. It's good.
Yeah, we're super fun.
Yeah.
All right. So diving in directly into the important topics, we're going to highlight a lot of things that Becky wrote about and researched for her book. The first thing is, let's talk about what happens before somebody does die or pass away. And Becky, you titled this in your book, the to die list. So if somebody comes to you and they say, I really want to start getting my affairs in order, I want to start to create my own, to die list, what would you tell them to do first, or what would you tell them to do in general?
Yeah. So the to die list in my book has 17 questions, which I probably can't go over all of them here if we're doing rapid fire. But there are a few, ultimately you want to plan as much as you can before you actually go. So the first thing I would say are the big three, or you should have an advanced healthcare directive, a power of attorney, and a last will and testament. And I think people don't want to do this for a couple reasons. A, paperwork is really boring. And B, a lot of people think they need a lawyer to do it and they need to pay for, gazillion billable hours to make this happen. An advanced healthcare directive and a power of attorney form, that's not true. Now, I'm not a lawyer and every state does things a little differently. But for the most part, you can find the advanced healthcare directive language and usually power of attorney language in your state statutes. And you can just print those out and fill it out. And then you just, it depends, some states want notaries, but you can just get it notarized and or witnessed by people. And that's something you don't need a lawyer for at all. In terms of a last will and testament, that goes into effect after you die. So those advanced healthcare directives and power of attorney forms are I am still alive, but incapacitated. The last will and testament comes after you actually kick the bucket. And that's when that goes into effect. And theoretically, it's good to talk to a lawyer to do that. I would say, especially if your estate is complicated, then maybe you want to talk to a lawyer. But there are websites where you can make them for low or no fee. They'll walk you through it step by step. That's how I made up my will, was on a website. And then you print it out, get it witnessed and notarized. So it's and there are sometimes community resources as well. At your local law school might have a clinic, that sort of thing. So those are the big three. Other stuff I can't go through them all if we're doing rapid fire, but how do you want to be remembered? What's your legacy like? Do you have any preferences for your funeral? What do you want people to do with your body? Do you want to be buried, cremated, human composted? That's an option. What do you want to happen to your pets? That's a big one. People don't think about that. They always assume that they'll outlive their pets, but that's not always true. So, decide who you want to take your pet after you die. That's a big thing. There's lots of stuff, obituary, anything you want in there. Just tell people what you want because they won't automatically know. They won't, be able to guess. But the big three, I would say, if you're going to be basic level, get your stuff together: power of attorney form, advanced healthcare directive, last will and testament.
Makes sense. So, and I think a lot of people, they're like, well, I'm not here, so it doesn't really matter what happens. That's another excuse. And I saw your facial reaction, so
Yeah, that's
talk to
an
me about that.
excuse. That's an excuse, but like you're putting all the burden onto your loved ones then. Like, oh, it won't matter because I'm dead. Well, it matters to your next of kin that they get it
Mhm.
right. They loved you and cared about you. So, um, if you can help them a little bit with that, just so they're not concerned for the rest of their lives that they did your funeral wrong or in a way that wouldn't have honored you, it can be helpful for you to, kind of alleviate some of that pressure.
Definitely. And what's one thing that people assume is handled that and like easily findable that really isn't?
Oh my gosh. I mean, everything. What's one thing that people assume is easily findable? I think they assume that like people will just automatically know, or that someone after you die, someone at the funeral home surely will tell your next of kin what their next steps are. And that's not true. No one is going to tell your next of kin what their next steps are. Unless, you can work that out with them in advance so that they know what they're supposed to do. Um, yeah, it's really hard to find all it's a very difficult situation to handle because there are a lot of legal and financial decisions that have to be made relatively quickly after a death. And so yeah, I think people assume that there's going to be all this help, that the court will help them, that the funeral home will help them. And that's not really what those things do. The funeral home is there to prepare the body and all of that and file for the death certificates. And the court is there to keep track of chain of title. It's not, nobody's there to be like a concierge to help your
Right.
loved one navigate all this.
It is a good business model though.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, 100%. And there's all these judgment calls and judgment decisions as soon as someone does die that the remaining responsible people have to make. And so to make things as easily findable and handled in advance as possible, it, to your point, adds a more comfort and clarity to the remaining people that they're honoring your legacy in the right possible way.
Yeah, and it's really the more you can plan, it's the greatest gift you can give someone. My parents were relatively prepared in terms of like they had wills of the living trust and all of that stuff. But we hadn't talked at all about like what they would want for a funeral or, and I still didn't know what my next steps were once I found the will and the trust. So if we had kind of made that a family project and talked about end of life stuff, I think, I and my sister, we would have felt much better prepared for what came next. But we never talked about that. And that's a regret I have. I think it would have been a lot easier if we had just had that discussion.
Yeah, you mentioned in our last episode, part one, and if you haven't listened to it, I highly recommend. But this conversation about money and logistics and legacy should be part of parenting. This should be, you know, at 3 months, the baby's going to be this big that and needs this amount of food or whatever it might be. At 2 years, this is how the baby's you're gonna interact with your child. At 18 years old, these are the conversations that you should be having around money, legacy, and values as parts of parenting. Like
Yeah,
this
it's like,
should be ingrained into like the parenting classes or who we are when we become parents.
right, like what to expect when you're expecting. The last chapter is like, and you need to talk to them. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, hopefully the book, I haven't read those books yet. I don't have any kids, but hopefully those books aren't too long that we can add another chapter that people
Yeah,
will
surely
read.
we can tack one on, right? There have been a million. That I don't know. I don't have kids either, but I'm assuming there have been. I feel like it's been around forever, so there have to be a million editions.
Yeah, but really, like, I love that point, and to reiterate, it should be part of parenting this conversation so that you are leaving your kids and your legacy well handled, and there aren't ambiguous decisions that your kids, your heirs, your spouse has to make.
Right.
So, Becky, another chapter is dying without a will. And so, what actually happens when somebody dies with a will versus without a will?
Well, again, I have personal caveat here. I'm not a lawyer and I cannot give formal legal advice. And I also, something that was difficult for me when writing the book is that every state and sometimes different counties within those states do estate law a little differently, right? So it was hard to write information that was going to be broad enough to be applicable to a general audience, but also not so broad that it was completely vague and people didn't get anything out of it. But generally, whether there's a will or not, your next of kin are going to have to go through a similar process. They're going to have to go through probate court. The difference about whether you die testate, that's with a will, or intestate, without a will, these are the fancy words they use. The main difference is that if you have a will, you have made decisions beforehand about who the executor is going to be. So which of your next of kin or your friends or whoever is going to handle your, the closing out of your estate and distributing all of that and paying off your creditors, etc. If you do not make a will, the court is going to decide who is going to handle that information. And they're also going to decide who your stuff goes to. So typically states follow very strict patterns of like blood relations. So like who is your next of kin in terms of like they'd probably go to like child first if you had a child. And then it might go to like sibling or parent. And then they'd work their way out. You know what I mean? So it works its way out and out. You can look at these crazy charts that they have for finding next of kin. And then, of course, if the court can't find anyone, the state will take the property. But there's some really important things. I think some people are like, oh, I don't have a lot to be behind. If my kid's going to have to go through probate anyway, why don't I just not have a will? Well, the reason is that because they focus so much on blood relation, there may be people you think are taken care of that are not taken care of. For example, if you have a stepchild, that's not always covered. Like that, unless you formally adopted them, that's not always covered. They might not get anything. If you have been living with someone long term, you have basically a domestic partnership, but you're not officially married, they might not get anything. So it really depends on the state and the area, but you just have a lot less choice when it comes to dying intestate, and you have to go through the state's intestacy laws. That's just, you have a lot more choice about what happens to your property and your assets and who is the person in charge of doling all of that out. It just creates a lot more trust, I think, rather than burdening someone who wasn't expecting to be burdened at all with this huge task. And then the court just decides who gets your stuff. I don't know. That's the big difference.
Yeah. And this is a general, way of how the chart goes, but obviously, if you're married legally, you have a spouse, and then it'll go down to your kids. And if you don't have any kids and you don't have a spouse, then it may go up to your parents, and your parents may not want or need the money, given where they are in life. And then it'll go out to your siblings and down to aunts and uncles, nieces and nephews.
Right.
It's just gets super complicated.
Yeah, it gets kind of complicated and it gets kind of messy. So I think to avoid the most strife, it's best to have a will. And I think people think, oh, I don't have that much, so I don't need to make a will. I don't have that many assets. And like I said, you're going to have to go through probate anyway. The court doesn't care if your only property is a car. You know what I mean? Like that's still going to have to go through probate. Someone's still going to have to take care of that for you. So you might as well choose who that is.
Yeah. Yeah, the will. It seems like the will is the set of instructions that helps the court decide who's making these decisions and how these decisions should be made and who receives X, Y, and Z items. And to tie question 1 and question 2 back together, like part 1 and part 2 back together, I mean, this is all part of your legacy. If you want to be remembered to have taken care of the right people and honored your word, then you should do the proper planning. If you don't give an F and you're just like, they'll figure it, like, which is hopefully none of us, but like if you just want to leave your life in shambles for other people, then that's what happens when you die without a will. And that's a very harsh statement, but it's true, because there are people that you're taking care of, there are people that you're living with, there are people, a stepchild, there are people in your life that care about you, and if you care about them too, then you should take this proper step.
Yeah, exactly. Like it's simply not a kind thing to do, not to make a will. If you care about the people, in your life, making a will is the right choice. And it's not as hard as people think it is.
100%. Yeah. It's just think of it as a checklist item on your, weekly calendar. You go get groceries, maybe you make a will. All right, let's move on to the next week where you don't have to make it the next week and you just get groceries. And
then check it every year, like once a year on your birthday or whatever. Just look it over, be like, is this still right? Like, is there anything I need? Yeah.
Maybe maybe we can make like the 6-month birthday, so it's not like on your birthday where you're celebrating your birth and you're like thinking about death. Maybe it's like your half birthday. You're like, oh yeah, like let me check what happens
Yeah,
in
that's a
my
good idea.
sequence.
Right. That's like will day. Like we're just gonna figure that out. If the nice thing is if you do use a website to make it, usually they'll send you a reminder once a year that's like, hey, do you need to update this? Which is kind of cool.
That is cool.
Hmm.
I'm actually making a note of that because I think Will Day should be
Yeah.
it.
Probably already is. I'm sure there's National Make a Will Day. I know there's like Advanced Healthcare Decisions Day. I'm sure there's a Make a Will Day. I don't know what it is offhand, but yeah, we need to promote it at least.
100%. Hopefully, yours and my platforms are strong enough to make
Yeah.
it
By our powers combined, we will make everyone make wills.
100%.
Yeah.
So the will indicates what goes to who, as well as who it becomes the executor and becomes the decision maker responsible for handling everything after a loss. So let's say if you have the grateful and lucky privilege of being somebody's executor,
So fun.
so fun, and handling everything after a loss, what does that actually look like? Maybe let's go for, what should that person do first? And then what does a day to day, week to week look like maybe a year, like within the first year after a loss?
Yeah, well, again, it depends on the estate laws of each and every individual state. Because isn't that fun that we do that in this country? Nothing is formula, you know what I mean? Nothing is standardized. It's all different. But there's like a general pattern typically. So first of all, I think people are worried like, oh, I have to do this immediately after my loved one has died. Like, here is their body, and I must do stuff immediately. In terms of probate, no, because you can't do anything until you get the death certificates. So the way you get the death certificates is the funeral home you're working with will, or crematorium, will get a lot of information for you and they'll file for those death certificates. And those death certificates are going to take anywhere, depending on your level of local bureaucracy, from like 1 to 4 weeks probably to come back to you. So you cannot start the probate process without a death certificate. And that is kind of a problem. I was just talking to someone who is trying to, like, their father-in-law recently passed, and because they haven't gotten the death certificates yet, they can't access his money. So they're paying for like all the upkeep on his house. They're paying for all, you know what I mean? The more everything they're paying for out of their own pocket because they don't have access to that money yet. But once they get the death certificates, they can start that process and pay themselves back. So anyway, once you get the death certificates, you can take a death certificate and the will, if it exists, to your local probate court, or I should say, the probate court where you're in the area where your parents or whoever has died resided, right? Because it's like if you live in a different state than the person who has died, that's not you don't matter. That's not the probate court you want to talk to. You want to talk to the court in the area where they resided, which is not necessarily the area where they died in my dad's case, but where their legal residence is. And then I talked to estate attorneys for my book. They recommend, if you can, starting this process within about a month of the death, right? It's not, no one's going to arrest you if like 2 weeks after the death you haven't started probate yet. You can do about a month. Once you get that process started, the court is going to get you some testamentary letters if there's a will, or letters of administration if there's not a will, kind of the same thing. And then you can use those letters and the death certificates to start handling all of the other processes. And the court will give you some things to do. Like there's usually, you have to file like notice for creditors in a newspaper or something like that. I would also say in the meantime, before you have the death certificates, if you want the help of an estate attorney, that's a good time to start looking for one. Because you might have, when you're not planning a memorial or whatever, you might have some time to talk to estate attorneys. Because they can help you. Like, even for the average person, navigating this is kind of complicated. So having an estate attorney who understands the system in the area where your loved one died can have huge benefits. They can help you. They can take a lot of this burden off your plate. They can give you much clearer instructions than the court might give you about what you're supposed to be doing exactly. But, then throughout the timeline, you're going to be going to their bank, you're going to be closing their accounts, you're going to be distributing the money, you're going to be doing their taxes. And this all happens over a period of months. I believe last time I checked, the average time it takes to close in a state is 6 months to 2 years, like somewhere in that timeline. But it can be a lot longer, especially if the estate was complicated. And there's no law that's like, you got to finish the estate at this time. You know what I mean? Like so it can kind of go on for as long as it needs to go on. It tends to be better to finish it as quickly as you can, just so that, nothing happens to you in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say from a duration as well, you also want to finish it as quickly as possible because you have a life, you have a job, you want that closure, as well as the beneficiaries. Like, more often than not, the last thing that you do as an executor is distribute the funds in the estate to the beneficiaries. Obviously, when there's money involved, people want their money. And so if you're waiting 2 years, and there's siblings and great kids and grandkids, or it's complicated and multiple family dynamics, people start asking the executor, where's my money? Where's my money? And they're putting pressure on you as well. So I want to just kind of, I think you don't need to do things immediately, and there is a balance of, like, yes, a lot of things are time sensitive to get things done. So what happens in the short term in that first month if you don't have a death certificate and you kind of aren't paying bills like the phone bill and interest on credit cards or something like that?
Well, I mean, what do you mean? What happens exactly? Like, I mean, if you're not paying their credit card bills or whatever, those credit cards will, be declined, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. You're going to have to cancel them anyway, and your dead parents' credit doesn't matter anymore. And it was worth noting again. I'm sure I said this last podcast, but you don't inherit your parents' debt, and your credit is not affected by your dead parents' debt in any way. Now, obviously, it's better to like actually call these credit card companies and negotiate and make sure you're closing things. But for example, after my dad died, I was in a little bit of a different situation where because my dad had a living trust, I was able to start dealing with those companies directly. I didn't have to wait for probate, because I had access to his bank accounts immediately. But if you don't have access to the bank account, I would say pay what you can, and once you do have access to the bank account, pay yourself back as the executor. Like, do feel free to take that money because it should be coming from the estate, not from your own money. But I mean, there's different. I guess I'm sorry if this is like a bad answer, but like within the context of your question, there's like so many circumstances that could apply there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
For sure. Yeah. I think one of the things that I did with my grandmother's estate is I didn't cancel her credit cards, and I had already taken the role of power of attorney before she died. And so because we didn't have a death certificate for 4 to 6 weeks actually after she died, because the examiner put the wrong date of death on her death certificate.
okay.
Yeah, right. It was just a laughable moment having this podcast as well, and knowing that they inevitably happen. I ended up just paying some of the things from her credit cards that were linked to her bank account, and kind of,
Oh, yeah,
yeah,
if you're the power of attorney, that's a great idea. If you still have access to those credit cards and you can use them and they don't know that your parent is dead, that's fine. Yeah.
right.
I would
So,
also say something that happened to me too is like, yeah, they want to talk. So every company is going to want a death certificate and all the official paperwork. This is not legal advice, by the way. This is just life advice. But
mhm.
here's the thing. If you have your parents' social security number, birthday, you have their ID, you have their information, you can just call and be like, hello, I would like to cancel my credit card. You know what I mean? And like, they don't know, just like, yeah,
Yeah.
so like, again, that's not the formal legal way to do it. That's not legal advice, but it is possible.
Yeah, let's just say you sometimes have to be creative to make things more efficient for your life.
Yeah.
And we'll dive into dealing with the banks and the institutions, but um, yeah, your next 6 months to 2 years are going to be day to day or week to week dealing with an attorney, a list of tasks, closing down somebody's life, working with the banks, working with the institutions, depending on how complex their life was. It could be a lot selling homes, selling cars.
Yeah. Yeah.
You don't have to make all of these decisions within the first month, but
No, don't.
Please don't. But over time, hey, let's get the death certificate, check, and
Mhm.
then let's write the obituary, plan a funeral. That's sort of all in the first month. Notify
Yeah,
Social
I would say
Security.
in the first month, focus more on mourning. You know what I mean? You have to wait for those death certificates anyway. So talk to relatives, have a memorial, write the obituary, do that stuff. Take care of that type of closure, and
Yeah.
then you can start worrying. Once you get the death certificates, then you can start worrying about all the probate stuff.
hmm You mentioned this a little bit ago, but hiring a lawyer, is there a threshold of complexity that you think a lawyer should or needs to be involved?
Theoretically, you can do it yourself. That would not be my advice. So I think people, similar to a lot of other things, are like, I'm going to have to pay this lawyer out of my own money. And in certain circumstances, that might be true if there wasn't a lot in the estate, but typically these estate attorneys get paid from the estate itself. They take it, it depends on the attorney. Sometimes they have an hourly rate, sometimes they take a portion of the estate. But um, yeah, like a percentage. But or sometimes a flat fee, depending on how big, if it's small enough, they might just flat fee. But it's a good idea to have an estate attorney. The fact is, you can do it yourself, but it's very, very complicated. And even the small stuff is kind of complicated, just like knowing what legal jargon the court is throwing at you and what that means and what you have to do. So it can be very helpful to have an attorney to kind of guide you through all of this stuff. And the way I would, when my dad died, I had talked to lawyers like socially before. I had never hired an attorney. I was like, oh no, how do I do that? So, I think you find a lawyer the same way you find any other, like the same way you find a hairdresser. You know what I mean? Like you call around, you look online for reviews, you ask your friends, your family for recommendations, and then once you have a list of people you want to talk to, you call them and talk to their offices and see what's the vibe. Do I like this person? Do I not like this person? Because you're going to have to work with them for like 6 months to a year. So, make sure there's someone that you reasonably get along with, and that you feel like you trust them and you feel like they have a good grasp of what's going on. It just has to be someone that you actually like. Because every lawyer's office is going to have a different vibe. That's just, lawyers are people too. Um, and and the State Bar Association website is also an option. A lot of them have searches where you can search for specific subjects. So, like if you look, they'll have a lawyer search, and then you can search for estate or elder law attorneys who might be able to help you.
Yeah. I think there's like my dad always said you get what you pay for, and I think there's a little bit of a threshold, right? So like you don't need to go the most expensive route to get like the purest concierge service. And there's a lot of times if you go on the less expensive end, you may not get the service that you want for attorneys. And so, find that sweet spot. And I love the way you said, find the person that you really get along with, because you're going to be working with them over 6 months to 2 years. And so, yeah, I think it's just super important to have a rapport with your attorney. Make sure you're not getting taken advantage of from a fee standpoint. Fees are always negotiable, so you can sort of negotiate down their fees. They may have a flat rate, um, and or you could just say like, hey, if they're billing hourly, I sent this email to both of you, and you both charged me for reading it. Do you mind, reversing this $100 fee here and there, because they're going to send you a monthly statement of what the fees encompass.
Right. And like, for example, I shouldn't have even theoretically had to have an estate attorney, because I had a living trust. So I should have, or my dad did. So I should have been able to take care of it all myself. But I think, as I said on the last episode, he left some assets out. So I had to go through probate court in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
But because the assets he left out were small enough, we were able to go through summary probate, which is like a faster version of probate. So in that case, the attorney just took a flat fee from like because there weren't
Yeah.
enough assets for them to bill otherwise.
And the attorney that drafts the documents for, a spouse or a parent, you don't have to go to them to probate your estate. That's a common misconception. With my grandmother, she had an attorney that drafted her will and trust and so on and so forth. And we went to them, and I had a decent rapport with them, but they were going to charge an astronomical fee for the probate because there were 18 beneficiaries. And I was like, you know what? I don't think, like, let me call around. Let me
Yeah.
call, another hairdresser or another attorney to see if they would charge less for a similar, if not better service.
Yeah, yeah. The same thing happened to me. I talked to my dad's attorney pretty shortly after he died, and I could tell right away that was not going to be a good fit. I, he just wasn't good at answering my questions. Like he could speak lawyer, he could not speak human. It was just very, I could tell that it was going to be a difficult relationship. And so I was like, oh, I don't want to talk to this guy. And then it turned out I needed an attorney in Florida anyway. So
Yeah. So it worked out for the best.
yeah.
So if you're in this spot where you're going to an attorney and you're interviewing them, for me, I'm gonna say a couple questions that I would ask, and Becky, I'd love for you to add on as well. So, you know, do you deal with a lot of probates of this size? You should have a rough estimate at this point, potentially, of like, hey, the house is worth $500,000 and the investments are worth another $500,000, and there's something here and there. Is this something that you commonly work with? And then, how are we going to work together? Am I going to work directly with you? Am I going to work with like a paralegal or an assistant on your team? And then, what are each of your rates, or what is the flat fee that you would charge? What can I rely on you for versus what, do I have to, as the executor, do myself? Those are some of the questions that I would ask in that initial first conversation. Is there anything that you would add?
No, I think those are really good questions to ask. I think that pretty much covers it. The one thing I would say, though, is you said by this point you should have a pretty good idea of what the assets of the estate are worth. And that's not always so easy. Theoretically, like what part of your responsibility as an executor or a personal administrator will be compiling a list of the assets and what they're worth. But I think, my parents didn't like leave like they were like, here's a list of this is something you can do for your next of kin that would be so helpful, to leave a list of assets and what they're worth, because they're going to have to compile it anyway. But I mean, there are some ways that you can look up some of that stuff. If you need to know the value of the house and you don't have like the paperwork or can't find it and you're like trying to figure stuff out, Zillow does estimates of like, you know what I mean? Like to get a vague, like a general idea, you know what I mean? You can look at like the Kelley Blue Book website for cars, right? You know what I mean? Just like to get like vague ideas of what everything costs, because it is a good idea when you're talking to an attorney to give them kind of like a general guess of what the estate might be worth.
Yeah, that's really good advice, feedback. So one thing you're going to have to do is deal with the bank and investment institutions. So I'm just going to say this bluntly: why do dealing with banks suck so much? And that may be general. So what are ways to make that process easier, or what was your experience like?
Well, charitably, the reason it's so difficult is because they're trying to prevent fraud. You know what I mean? They don't want people to get the money who shouldn't be getting the money. But boy, do they make it hard to get that money. Like any other institution, you're going to need a lot of paperwork when you're going to the bank, or if you're dealing with an investment firm of some kind. You're going to need a death certificate. You're going to need a letter of administration or a testamentary letter from the court, typically, to say, hey, I'm allowed to get this money. And so you go, it's often something that's easier to do in person, which means you might have to travel a little bit, so you can deal with an actual person at the actual bank rather than sitting on the phone hoping they get back to you and having them transfer you to their manager, to their manager, to their manager. It's easier to just have the paperwork in front of you and be like, here you go. So it's extremely time consuming, and you probably will have to talk to multiple different people. You would think that they would have this down to a pat because people die all the time, but that doesn't seem to be the case. So I mean, it's just you have to prove that you're the person who's in charge of that money. And then once you do prove that you're in charge of that money, it usually doesn't stay in that account. They like create an estate account for it. So it's like this new account, but you're in charge of that. So it's like a whole process getting your hands on the money. And then I would say the bank was hard, but it was not like the investment institutions. Those are nightmare places, because stocks, they want even more documentation to prove that you are who you say you are. So typically what they need is a medallion signature guarantee, which I can't remember if we talked about on the last episode, but it's like a notary stamp, but fancier. You can only get it at certain banks and not all banks provide it. And it's like it effectively does the same thing as a notary. It's just like the financial institutions were like, we're too snobby for notaries. So you have to go get a medallion signature guarantee, and it is a huge pain. I'm not going to lie. There's really no way around it. It's a huge pain to find someone who will do it and make an appointment with them and get in and have it stamped. And, then you're probably going to end up, they'll be like, oh, great, we got this form. Now to move to step 2 of the process, here's another form that you also have to get a medallion signature guarantee on. It's just a huge pain. So I would say that that's why those institutions are painful, is that they are, in theory, trying to prevent fraud. So they're making it, they make it pretty difficult to prove that you're the person who should take over this money. And I would say one way you can make that easier in advance, theoretically, is there are like pay on death bank accounts where you can create a bank account that has a beneficiary, like a life insurance policy. And that doesn't have to go through probate court. So if you have like a, so if you have at least a certain account, that would at least get part of the money to the person beforehand, and it would become theirs without having to go through probate. But yeah, if I could change anything about this, I would just say like streamlining this process, making it easier for regular people who are just people who are grieving and don't want to spend like 4 hours of their life inside a bank, Yeah.
It's super time consuming, but I love that advice of back to the to-die list and the pre-planning, leaving beneficiaries on all of your accounts is super important, whether it's a transfer on death, payable on death, beneficiaries on your IRAs. That makes things a little bit easier. They'll need a little bit less information from you, and it'll make things a little bit more efficient, less time consuming. But anything we can do to make it, more efficient.
Yeah.
And less.
I would also say if you have beneficiaries on any account, whether it's your retirement account, whether it's a pay on death bank account, make sure you update those beneficiaries. When you get annoying emails from HR that are like, hey, you need to update the beneficiary on your retirement account, do it. Because I have heard so many, those supersede a will. And I have heard so many horror stories from people who never updated their beneficiaries and like left all their money to their ex-wife. You know what I mean? So it's just, you need to make sure you are updating those beneficiaries. That's really important.
100%, definitely. And then, so with utility bills and subscriptions and recurring charges, why do these become such a problem? And how do you find and access all these like digital accounts and paper accounts?
Yeah, I forget the exact number, but the average person in the United States has something like over 100 online accounts just for like various different sites. And so much of what we use nowadays are like not things we own, but our subscription services. We use it for our music, for our TV, for sometimes for like other things in the home are like subscription based, right? So there can be a lot of bills, and it's really hard to keep track of them all. They're not always necessarily coming to you in the mail, and they're just recurring charges. So they just keep going, right? So if you can get into your parents', whether they're on their phone or whether on a computer, it's really important to be able to get into their email. That's where like a lot of these things are going to be, where you're going to be seeing this stuff. And I would say like, especially with entertainment-based subscription services, that's kind of the stuff you want to cancel first, because you don't really need it, right? You know what I mean? They're certainly not watching it, and you don't really need to keep it. There might be some bills you want to keep going. Like if you're selling the house, you probably want to keep like the lights on and the water on so people who are coming to your house can see it, right? But for like Netflix, that you can cancel, or like your gym membership or something like that. And it's just hard because it's like I said, it's one thing if the bills are coming to their house in the mail, but probably not for a lot of these subscription services. Sometimes if you cancel, like if you don't realize there was a subscription going, and then like 4 months later you realize that they've been paying for Netflix out of their account this whole time. Sometimes you can like negotiate with a company and be like, they died, I don't think I should have to pay for these 4 months. But it's hard. You have to like put in the work to do that. Like sometimes they will agree, but you got to be on the phone with some Netflix representative that takes you an hour just to get in touch with a real person in order to do that. Companies don't want to give you their money back. They don't want to do that. So yeah, it's just, it's very complicated keeping track of all of these accounts. So I would say one of the biggest ways to prevent this is just like passwords. If you can get your loved one to get a password manager, that's the best thing, because then they only have to leave you one password. but my parents were not technologically savvy enough for that. So my dad wrote down his passwords. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, but it was a good start. It was definitely a good start.
Yeah. So the first thing that came to mind is the new movie on Netflix called Voicemails for Isabel. I don't know if you've seen it, but highly
No.
recommend. Absolute tearjerker. Really beautiful. And the premise is Isabel, who is the main character's sister, dies, and they always talk to each other over the phone, gave each other life updates. And when Isabel died, her phone number was still active, and then got transferred to somebody else, a guy who got access, like got the phone number, and then was receiving all of these voicemails to the main character's dead sister. And so then they fall in love, so on and so
Yeah,
forth.
of course. I was like, yeah.
It's beautiful, but I think you don't want to. Maybe the phone bill is $100 a month or something like that. You don't, if you're using the phone to access the passwords and reset things and maybe receive notes from family and friends. You don't necessarily have to cancel the phone immediately. You can keep
Right.
that going for a couple months and pay for it through the estate. So maybe that's something that you would want to keep going in addition to the utility bills, the lights, the water in the house, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I would say, especially with a phone, it's almost, and it's so annoying because phone bills can be so expensive, but it can almost be crucial to keep that one on because in addition to getting in touch with people and all of that stuff, two-factor authentication is how we sign into a lot of things these days. So it's not really helpful if you're trying to log into your parents' thing on a computer and then it's like, we need to text you a code, and then you can't get the code because you don't have access to the phone. So that can be really helpful for a few months while you're canceling all these accounts to have the phone on. Speaking of voicemails, this is a side topic, but if you have voicemails from your dead loved ones, save them. That's a really great thing. I would recommend, and then like upload them somewhere so you have them. I have voicemails from my parents still, and it's like I can listen to them when I want to hear their voice.
That's really special. Yeah, part of this movie is her voicemails get from her dead sister get deleted, and I won't spoil the whole thing, but it's very very sad moment when she loses the voice of her.
Oh, I bet.
Who she loved.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'll link that movie in the show notes. So it sounds like this role is just hours on hold, navigating over 100 online accounts on top of investments, on top of money coming like in different situations, cars, real estate, businesses, so on and so forth. So speaking about, just the repetition and the bills and the subscriptions and so on and so forth, do you have a system to stay organized, and do you have maybe a framework or any advice of how people can do this without losing their minds?
Yeah, because it's a full-time job that's not a full-time job, and you're not gonna like it's a full-time job, but no one's gonna treat it that way. You just have to like keep up with all of your other life stuff, which is why there's still loose ends where I'm like, crap, it's like been years and I still have to do this thing because it's a huge pain and I have a life. But and again, my situation's a little different because of the trust. But anyway, I would recommend it is important to stay organized because you're going to be in paperwork hell. A lot of people do this stuff through paper and it has to be done through paper and you can't always do things electronically. So you're going to need to keep copies of everything. You're going to need all the copies of the death certificates, and it's important to stay organized. I think it's important to stay organized in the way that makes the most sense to you. So I bought like one of those little like huge binders that you see at back to school season where it has like file folders in there and it has like a 3-ring binder for paper. And then it's got like, it just has it's like a pencil case in there. So I just carried like everything with me in that to every meeting. I had like the death certificates, the will, the trust, everything, just so I could go and like I was never missing a piece of paperwork because I could just pull it out. Keeping that organized is a pain, but I had everything I needed, right? You can be organized in whatever way makes the most sense to you. If that's like a file cabinet, if that's, whatever. Whatever makes the most sense to you is the way you should go. There are also a lot of products that people use to help get organized in advance of their own deaths. There are a lot of binders for that. There's like a big box thing you can buy called the Knock Box. That's one that has like file folders for everything you would need to prepare and give to your next of kin. That's why it's called Knock Box. It's next of kin. This is not an advertisement. I just have one and I think it's neat. But But those organizers are very helpful after a death too. So like even if the person didn't have one before they died, it can be a really great way to organize their stuff after they died. But like there are so many of these products, like you can find tons of them. So search around, like look for like end of life organizers or like death planning, estate planning organizers. You can find lots of stuff. But I think because you're the one doing the work, it's like someone else's organization system is not always going to work for you. It's important to organize in a way that makes sense to you. But do keep that paperwork handy and make sure you are organized, because not only will you need the paperwork to go through all these institutions and stuff, but as the executor or personal administrator or the successor trustee, if you have a trust, you're responsible for like answering not only to these businesses and everything, but to the beneficiaries. So if they ask to see a copy of the will, you got to have a copy of the will to show them. You know, if they ask for an update, you have an obligation to update them. So it's just really important to keep track of all this stuff. Luckily, it's just me and my sister, and I'm always like, hey, do you want an update? And she's like, no, that's boring. I'm like, okay.
No, how are you? Like, did you catch the episode of the new show?
Yeah.
Additionally, obviously, if you're listening to this episode and if you're listening to it out loud, maybe Instagram has already targeted you for the knockbox or things like that.
Yeah.
There are a ton of different things, and you call it like the trap keeper, right?
The trapper keeper, like an 80s trapper keeper. Like, you know,
Okay.
I called mine my Uber Death Notebook. That's how I named it. So I carry around my Uber Death Notebook. I still have it.
Yeah. So literally for my dad's estate, I had a notebook and like a file folder and stuff like that. For my grandmother's estate, I've kind of, utilized technology a little bit more and have a Google Drive that says, grandmother's estate. And I have the important estate documents folder. I have all of like some copies of wills and all the estate documents. I have the copies of bills and account numbers and stuff like that, so that I can have that with me on my phone or computer wherever I am.
Yeah.
So that works for me. Having the physical copies may work for you. I love the advice of finding a way to stay organized that works. That makes the most sense.
I mean, and I think it can kind of depend on the phase where you are too in the estate, because for me, the reason I was using like a physical document thing, I like online stuff as much as the next person, but like they won't, if you're at the DMV, they need a paper copy of something. Right. They're not going to accept a digital one. So unless you can like print it out right there. But if it's sort of like later on and you're just keeping these files like for your own, you know what I mean? Like for backup or whatever. Yeah. Right. Then like don't keep a gazillion papers in your house that you don't need. You can back them up in like digital form.
Right. Don't get me wrong. Basically, I have this coffee table that opens into and has like storage underneath. So the storage underneath the coffee table, because I was getting so much mail and like just bombarded with bills and stuff like that, that became grandma's estate storage unit.
Yeah.
And so I would just be like, all right, another bill, and just like toss it under there. Cause like I knew I needed to keep it, but I didn't know what I would need it for in the future. And then upon moving, we purged that drawer because we were at, simultaneously at the same time closing down the estate.
Right. Yeah. So satisfying to be like, we don't have to move this. Yeah.
100%.
Yeah.
So another part of the book was inheriting the responsibility you didn't ask for. And this is a lot of the book. So executorship and so on, and anything that you inherit. But estate aside, let's say you suddenly inherit a business that you never asked to be in charge of. I know you wrote about this. So any insights on that?
Yeah, this could have very easily happened to me because my parents were both small business owners, but fortunately they had sold their businesses a few years before they, retired and all that stuff. So luckily I didn't have to inherit a business, but that could be a thing that happens to you. A business is an asset like anything else. So I would say in that case, you're definitely going to want a lawyer. Like if you're dealing with a business, like this is not something you should really try to handle on your own. Hopefully the business already has an attorney. Talk to that attorney, talk to that business's accountant, talk to the other people who work there. You know what I mean? Like surely unless it was like a single person LLC or something, if it's like a whole business, they probably have other employees who all need to know what direction to go. Businesses are supposed to have like basically an estate plan, like what happens if the owner dies, but not all of them do, especially if they're smaller businesses. So if there is one of those plans in place, follow it. That's a good idea. But keep in mind that, there are like customers relying on, there's just a lot more people who are customers and suppliers who are like relying on this business to keep operating or needing to do stuff. And I would just say, as much as you can, be forthright with those people. I think people understand that the worst does happen sometimes. So just, be honest with the employees, with suppliers, with customers, be like, this is what's happening. We are working on it. This is our succession plan if we have one. But in this case, especially when you've got a lot of other people who have money involved, attorney, accountant, big one. Those are going to help you for there. That's something you need in that case. You don't want to try to be doing all that stuff on your own.
And it goes back to pre-planning. You mentioned succession plan. Having a succession plan, whether you're a 2-day-old business or a 20-year-old business, is super important because, as you mentioned, people are relying on orders to be filled. And there's a ripple effect when somebody dies that if an order can't be filled, or if you're a mental health therapist and you can no longer see your patients, like, then you're leaving people stranded, and that's also part of your legacy. So pre-planning that succession plan, or as an executor, maybe coming up with one, is super important to make sure that people are served in the right way. And the value of the business isn't solely relying on one person. There are ways to continue the business.
Right, exactly.
And on a similar vein, let's say somebody unexpectedly comes into money. They were the beneficiary on $1 million life insurance policy. What's the first thing they should do, and what's the first thing that they probably shouldn't do?
Well, lucky you if you're the beneficiary on $1 million policy. I would say the first thing is don't spend it all. Like, you know what I mean? Like, don't spend all your money. That's what you shouldn't do. I would just say be very careful with it. So I would recommend, especially if you're coming into that much money, definitely talking to a financial planner. Like, that's someone who can, like, it's their job to help you figure out how that works. And there are different ways you can do that. Like, often banks, like if you're a member of a bank, they will often have people there who are financial planners that you can use because you're already a member. So that's one way to do it. When I worked at a big corporation, they had like financial planning as an employee benefit. So I was able to talk to a financial planner that way. There's a thing called FEC Public. So there are some cities who are part of this network where they'll have like free financial planning for residents of the city. So you can go to, I believe it's fecpublic.org. Don't quote me on that. We'll put it in the show notes. But there might be free financial planning in a city near you, or like look at community colleges, that sort of thing. They might offer those options as well. Or you can pay for a financial planner. And it's important to keep in mind the distinction between your inheritance versus the estate, right? These finances should not mingle. You know what I mean? If you have a financial planner for your inheritance, that wouldn't necessarily be the person. You can't pay for that with the estate money. You know what I mean? Your inheritance is your own money. So that's what I would say is just like get some expertise in there if you're suddenly handling a lot of money, because it could grow into a lot more money for you. Like that could be like a huge, huge cushion. And so you don't just want to like spend it all willy-nilly. You want to make sure you're doing the right thing with it. I would also say short term, like I'm not going to be able to high yield savings accounts. Those are a good thing to chuck some money in there, that if you want to be able to access it easily, but you still want it to have a high rate of return. That's been super helpful to me personally, is I have a high yield savings account, and it gives me a lot of money back. You know what I mean? So it grows pretty quickly in there. And then I still have money that I can grab if I need it for a trip or whatever.
Yeah, I love that. I think the big thing is to get help, because your whole financial infrastructure has just changed overnight, and to not make any major decisions. So a high yield savings account is a great place to park money, to sit and earn, let's just call it right now, 3% of interest, give or take a couple percent. And that's at little to no risk, which is great. If you go to Vegas and you put it all on black, you are risking all of it. If you go to the stock market and you bet on a single stock, yes, it could go down overnight. So a high yield savings, like you you just inherited $1 million. Let's see how that plays into the rest of your financial structure, and let's sit on it for a little bit. If when dealing with financial planners and financial advisors, spoken as a prior financial planner, financial advisor, the incentives of that planner is to, not only to help you, but also to help you invest money with them. And so a lot of the times they are going to want you to open an investment account and start, making moves and doing things. There are a bunch of fee only financial planners that would potentially charge a fee for an hour of their advice. And you can get a vibe for if you gel with them, same as the attorney or not. So this is hopefully somebody that you're going to be working with for a number of years in the future. You're not contractually stuck with that person, but find someone who has your best interest in heart.
Yeah, and look for people who have like fiduciary, like these people should have a fiduciary obligation to you, right? They're not enriching themselves over you,
Mm-hmm.
So make sure, they have people who are like very clear about that. Yeah, it's like another thing where you want to talk to people and make sure you like their vibe, because this is a partnership that theoretically is going to last a long time.
Yeah. And certified financial planners are legal fiduciaries to their clients. And so if you look for the CFP designation, that is just one way to find a fiduciary.
Yeah.
What is the biggest mistake or a common mistake that you see people make right after an inheritance?
I don't know that I would see. I think just like spending it, you know what I mean? Like, or, thinking that, yeah, I think just spending it all right away. And like, that's, in what context is that a mistake? Like, there are some people who are like wildly in debt, right? You know what I mean? And this inheritance gives them the option to pay off that debt, and that's good. I mean, I guess a bigger mistake, or something that I would be more worried about, is when you're the executor or the personal administrator, you have to be very careful, because creditors do come first when it comes to the estate money. So no matter how much is left to the beneficiaries, you have to pay the creditors off first. And so there's like the beneficiaries get whatever's left over after the creditors have it, and that could be nothing. So it's just, you have to be very careful with that money. And like, if a beneficiary is like, can I have like $1,000 to do this one you know what I mean? Don't necessarily give it to them right away, because that money might need to go to creditors, you know what I mean? And then you're like out of that, so I think you have to be like very careful with that distinction, and understand that. But in terms of an inheritance, I think generally, unless you really are in like dire financial straits, and this inheritance will sort that out immediately, I think just spending it all right away is typically not a good idea. You should really try to set yourself up so that inheritance works for you over time.
For sure. And I think going back to pre-planning, having the conversation as to with your parents or with the person who is potentially giving you this inheritance in the future, what do you want me to do with this money? Like, in your ideal visions, what are your intentions and desires for leaving this money, so that you can still honor their legacy? Granted, if you have credit card debt or student loans, and you need to wipe that out, you can do that. That may not be that may or may not be their wish, but having the conversation so that you are using it for the purpose that they left it for you, as well as to make your life, to enhance your life, like slowly but incrementally.
Yeah. I mean, to be clear, once the inheritance is yours, it's yours, and you don't have to follow their wishes for it.
Right.
But I think it's a nice thing to do if they do have wishes for it. To be clear, in a will, someone theoretically could put stipulations on your inheritance. They could be like, you only inherit this money if you go to Georgia State or something like that.
Yeah.
Like, they could do that. They can't make you do anything illegal, but they theoretically can put stipulations on when and how you receive that money. But a lot don't. You know what I mean? It's just like, this is just who gets it once the creditors got their fight.
But I think that's a really important thing, and maybe in the will, it may also be in the trust, but like, yeah, there are sometimes legal stipulations. There are, especially if you're giving it to a young person or a minor, and you're planning for your own kids and family. Maybe they only get it at a certain age, or they only they get it. If you can use those stipulations to motivate and encourage them to continue the value. So,
Yeah.
maybe it's, you have to have, I'm just making this up, but like 50 hours of volunteer work a year. And because giving back to the community is super important to the
Right.
family values.
Right. And I mean, everyone should make a will. But if you have kids, you need to make a will. Like, you need to make a will if you have kids.
Yeah.
Because there's a lot more than just what happens to your money. It's like what happens to your kid. So, it's
Yeah.
like it's really important to do that planning in advance if you have children.
Yeah. So this question came from the cleaning out of the house chapter. And so somebody else's belongings, obviously very overwhelming to go through, all the other people, like a lifetime of belongings. And so how do you separate the practical decisions of all of this, but in the frame of cleaning out a house of belongings, from the emotional ones when you're staring at a lifetime of stuff?
Well, it's really complicated because there's a lot of factors going into this. There's this dual guilt that you might have of either being too attached or not attached enough to all the stuff that makes up a life. You might be like, I don't really care about this picture, but like I'm irrationally attached to a soap dispenser or something like that. Which is irrational is a strong word here. Who's to say what is rational or irrational to be attached to? But so there's a few considerations. I mean, one man's trash is another man's treasure. That's another problem. So you think, oh, I'm just getting rid of the towels. And then your aunt is like, I really wanted those towels because I had so many memories of So I would say, first of all, make sure that there aren't specific things in the will that are left to specific people. Those things need to go to those people. So don't start throwing stuff away when the dining table was meant to go to your sister or whatever. Make sure that that stuff goes to who it's supposed to go to. I would also say it is kind if there are people like my sister and I were the only beneficiaries of my parents' trust, but I talked to my parents' siblings and was like, hey, do you want any of this? Because they were your siblings. You know what I mean? Like, do you want any of this stuff? I think if you can, it's kind to give people the opportunity to look through it. And also that's taking some stuff off your hands. You know what I mean? But my particular aunts and uncles were like, we are old and we don't need more stuff. And I was like, hey, not helpful. Thanks for not taking anything else off my hands. Great. But yeah, I mean, it's a lot of process. You have to decide what's important to you, what's not. It's great if you have time. If you have a little bit of time before you can sell their stuff, you know what I mean? Then you have like the time to go through it and make those decisions. But you don't always have that time. Sometimes things have to be done to the place quickly, right? And you have to get rid of stuff. So one thing you can do is like, if you can't save a thing, you can take a picture of it to have, that's one thing you can do. You can, if you're overwhelmed and you're like, I absolutely cannot do this, there are companies that will get a house ready for sale. There are companies that are just junk companies that will just take everything away if there was like a hoarding situation and you're dealing with a lot of stuff that like is impossible for one single person to clean out. There are companies that'll take everything away. There are estate sale companies. If your parents had things that are like valuable, but you don't really know how to sell it, you can hire a company to help you set up an estate sale. Or of course, if it's less valuable, you can have like a yard sale or, whatever, make some money off of the stuff. But it's just a really complicated process because, how much stuff goes into a life? A lot, usually. So, yeah, my advice would be like, if you have time, take the time so that you're not making immediately rash decisions in the wake of a death, like throwing away something you would regret. But it's also understandable that you have a life to live, and so you can't be weighed down by other people's stuff forever. Just, I think, both remember that not everything, throwing away their stuff is not throwing away them,
Yeah.
Yeah. But
100%.
yeah, the big thing is just make sure that there aren't specific items that are supposed to go to specific people, because you don't want to give away something that was meant to be given to someone.
Yeah, I've contemplated this estate sale consignment concept and getting another company to help you sell it, or it's you selling it yourself. Obviously, there's a lot of time that may be minimal that you would need to put into that. Granted, you could, in your words, if you're dead tired, just delegate it to somebody else. But I think, let's say there's a grandfather clock that's been passed down for generations, and You don't have any room in your house, or none of the beneficiaries want it, but it may have emotional, sentimental value to you. I just think it's fascinating how you may overvalue some of these items from a cost and value standpoint, and other people who may be buying it may not feel that sentimental value, may either undervalue it or rightfully value it. And then there's an emotional toll that you go through with.
It's really hard. Like my dad was an architect, and I had to figure out what to do with all of his drawings. He had all of his paper drawings. They're not worth anything. You know what I mean? They're not like, they don't have a monetary value. It's not like he was a famous architect. But like, we can't save all of them either. So like, which buildings of his are the most important for us to save for posterity? So we can like frame one. You know what I mean? It's just, but it seemed crazy. I was like, I can't throw out all of his life's work. That was really hard. So I was on the phone I was in Florida sorting them out, and I was on the phone with my sister being like, what do we think about the courthouse? Is that one? Probably we should keep that one. That's a big county courthouse. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I would just say on the separating emotional from practical and financial decisions, there's no right or wrong decision. It's just what feels right. And it's really hard. What you said is important. It's really hard to go through that.
And it can be helpful too to have a friend, if like you have a friend or a relative or whatever who's willing to come in and do it with you. That takes some of the burden off you, but they can sometimes also put some of that outside perspective on there.
Yeah.
Too. They can gently be like, do we need to save every old light bulb or whatever?
Right. Shout out to my girlfriend who was moving in with me while we were going through my grandma's stuff. And she's like, we really don't need this like little thing that sits on your lap so that you can like do your homework or write pieces of paper on the couch. It's like, this is just going to take up space as much as we love to honor grandma.
Yeah. It's important to honor grandma, but that does not mean keeping all of grandma's belongings.
100%. Yes.
By the way, this is another thing you can do before you die. This is a great thing to do, is clean out your stuff. You don't need to hold on to everything as you age. Gentle Art of Swedish Death Cleaning. Great book.
Gentle Art of, okay.
Yeah, the art of Margarita Magnuson, I think she just died a few months ago. But she wrote it when she was, in her 80s, I think. And it's like a really charming book that has a lot of really good, useful advice about how to weed through your stuff and get rid of some of it, so your kids aren't like, oh no, I have like everything to deal with.
No, I'm going to link it to the show notes and probably read it myself.
Yeah, it's very short, very good book. It does feel like it's written by a grandma. It's very cute.
I like that. So 2 more questions. You embarked on the journey of becoming a death doula. What did you learn?
Oh my gosh, I learned so many things. So I trained with the Death Wives out of Colorado, who are no longer an organization, but they've like split into 2. So they both are still death doulas who do their own separate organizations. But I did some online trainings with them. I learned, I wanted to learn how to be a death doula, partially for research for my book, and partially because for me, my parents' deaths were not as difficult as my parents dying. The dying part was really difficult for me. I did not know what to expect. It was pretty hard to watch for me. So one thing that was really nice about training as a death doula is that I learned a little bit more about the active dying process. So I learned more about what that looks like. So I can reflect back and being like, oh, when my mom was reaching out for nothing and it seemed kind of distressing, that's normal. That's like that. She wasn't distraught. That's not like a normal thing. That's a totally normal thing that people do when they're dying. They're not like in pain. She's not worried. It's just terminal agitation. It's something that happens. So I think what's really nice is like, it's nice to train as a death doula, even if you don't want to practice as a death doula, like even if that's not what you want to do for your job, because we all know people we all know everyone is going to die. We're all going to be near someone who's dying. And if you know a little bit how to make a dying person more comfortable, that's an important skill to have. If you know about the active dying process, if you know about legacy making, these are conversations that you can have with people in your life. And it just, I think, makes you more adept at those conversations and gives you a lot of actual helpful knowledge for like what to do with a dying body, with a dying person, how to sit vigil with them, how to make them more comfortable, how to incorporate what they want and have those conversations. Like, what do you want your actual dying to be like? Well, who do you want in the room? What music do you want on? Do you want a candle? No? Yes? You know what I mean? Just like having those specifics down can be really helpful and make a death a lot easier.
Yeah, I think that experience is invaluable, especially to the work that you are doing and have done, and obviously the book as well. So it's really interesting perspective that you have.
Yeah, I do a lot of educational work as a death doula. Like I do a lot of like workshops, or I run a monthly death salon. I don't have a lot of one-on-one clients just because it's not something that people realize they need a lot yet. I think we're going to see that change over time. But that's okay because that educational work is helpful. And when I volunteer with hospice patients, they didn't hire a death doula, so I'm not trying to like plan their good death with them or whatever. You know what I mean? But those skills that I learned are still very helpful in terms of making them comfortable at the end of life. Positioning them in certain ways, or like holding their hand when they need that, or like kind of understanding what their body is going through.
Yeah, definitely. That makes sense. So, Becky, as we wrap up here, I have one more question back to the emotional side of all of these financial and logistical tasks and things that you have to do after somebody dies. So, what is your advice on how to avoid emotional scarring after this type, or while going through and after this type of experience?
Well, I can't you can't blame yourself. Things are going to go wrong and it's not going to be your fault, or like even if it is, like you're going to fill in a form wrong or whatever. You can't sit there blaming yourself for the rest of your life for not being totally perfect at a process that nobody has a lot of experience going through. So you need to forgive yourself, and you need to, give yourself a lot of grace throughout this process. If you can give other people grace, although that's sometimes a little bit harder, but especially knowing that people grieve differently. I think that's, really important to be able to do if you can. I would say, remember that you're still alive, right? Your loved one may be dead, but you're still alive. So if you can, prioritize yourself over over the estate. Probate court is never going to love you back. So making sure you're prioritizing yourself is really important, and keeping up your hobbies, keeping up with your friends. Assuming you're feeling okay to do that, I think that's something you should do, and you shouldn't feel guilty about doing that stuff. As an executor or a personal administrator, there may be some things you legally cannot delegate, but you should delegate everything you can. If there is a part of a process, if you're like, I've got this information, but I can't make this phone call right now, or can you drop this at the post office, or can you, anything like that. Can you help plan the funeral? Because that's not something that's like legally up to the executor. Can you help like order flowers or whatever? That's great. Delegate that stuff. Have somebody else do it. Absolutely. Don't try to do everything at once. You can't. It's going to take however long it takes. So don't try to do everything at the same time. Please calm down. It's just going to, it's going to take as long as it takes. So you cannot do it. Take it week by week, day by day. And then I would also say it's okay to grieve. Like, I know probably everyone's sick of hearing it, but there's no wrong way to grieve. So if you're curled up in a ball crying, that's fine. If you are very active in your grief and you're like me and you make a website, that's fine. It's just like, do what you need to do to get through it. And it's okay to be grieving. You're not like wrong for doing that. It's okay if you start crying when you're going through your parents' stuff. It's okay if you don't. It's okay if you don't cry at their funeral. You know what I mean? Like, just give yourself grace, because this is not a situation that anyone is like really good at going through. You're being asked to do so much work on top of deep grieving. And that's, never going to be a situation where anyone is at their best. So forgive yourself and give yourself some grace, and get your friends in there, get a support network. Really helpful.
Perfect. I think you said it incredibly. Obviously, it's easier said than done, but this isn't a process that, hopefully we don't have to go through very often in life. It's not something that we practice. And so delegate, don't try to do everything at once. Forgive yourself. It's okay to be fine or not to be fine. And just do your best and live your life the best way you can. I always say, I go back to the running and the marathon analogy. Just try to put one foot in front of the other every single day, whether that's making progress on the estate or not curling up into a ball. Whatever feels right in that moment, just try to do your best.
Yeah.
Well, Becky, this has been an amazing episode. Last episode was amazing. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this 2-part series and imparting so much wisdom on our audience and me personally. Thank you so much for your time and joining me on the Currency of Grief.
No, thank you for having me. This was great. And I'm so happy to talk and share all this stuff. And yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course. And podcast family, thank you so much for listening to another episode of the Currency of Grief. Don't forget, it's a great day to have a great day. So go have a great day, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you for joining me on this episode of the Currency of Grief podcast. My hope is that today's conversation brought you clarity, comfort, and even a spark to start those difficult but necessary conversations in your own life. If you found this episode helpful, it would mean the world to me if you would share it with one other person who you feel this podcast could impact. And please, take a moment to leave us a 5-star review. Your review will help us reach more people who need this resource. Remember, the best time to talk about death and money was yesterday. The second best time is now. Until next time, I'm Justin Weidenfeld, your Grief Financial Officer, and this has been the Currency of Grief podcast.